The date is January 20th, 2026. While the world watches nervously, President Donald Trump has just doubled down on his threats to acquire Greenland, declaring on social media that there is no going back. In response, Denmark has deployed an additional 58 soldiers to the Arctic territory, adding to the approximately 60 troops already stationed there for Operation Arctic Endurance. This is not a distant territorial dispute. This is a fundamental crisis that threatens to tear apart the very fabric of NATO, and Ukraine should be watching very, very carefully. Because what is happening in the frozen waters of the North Atlantic today could determine whether Kyiv receives the weapons it desperately needs tomorrow. Let's be clear about what we're witnessing. For the first time in NATO's 77-year history, a member state is openly threatening to seize territory from another member state. Trump has refused to rule out using military force to take control of Greenland, a self-governing Danish territory. When asked directly by NBC News if he would use military action, his response was chilling. No comment. This is not diplomatic posturing. This is not negotiating tactics. This is a sitting U.S. president threatening a NATO ally with potential military invasion while simultaneously announcing punishing tariffs. On January 18th, Trump declared that Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland would face a 10% import tariff starting February 1st, 2026, escalating to 25% by June 1st. Unless Denmark agrees to sell Greenland. Think about that for a moment. 8 NATO allies, countries that have stood shoulder to shoulder with America through conflicts from Kosovo to Afghanistan, are now being economically coerced by Washington. And the ransom demand? Surrender sovereign territory. You might ask, what does a frozen Arctic island have to do with the war in Ukraine? Everything. Greenland is not just strategically located between North America and Europe. It hosts Pituffik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, one of the most critical early warning radar installations in the Western defense architecture. Its position provides unparalleled access to monitor Russian submarine movements, ballistic missile launches, and Arctic military activity. The island sits atop vast reserves of rare earth minerals, critical for everything from smartphone screens to missile guidance systems. But here's what matters for Ukraine. The same president who is threatening Denmark is the same president who will decide whether to send ATACMS missiles, F-16 ammunition, and Patriot batteries to Kyiv. The same administration currently fracturing NATO unity over Greenland is the one negotiating Ukraine's future with Vladimir Putin. Denmark has been one of Ukraine's most stalwart supporters. At the NATO summit in 2025, Copenhagen announced 1.26 billion euros to support Ukrainian production of long-range drones. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has championed Ukraine's EU accession and provided critical military aid. Yet now, Denmark finds itself branded a potential security concern by the very ally it has supported for decades. The message to Ukraine is unmistakable. If America will turn on Denmark, a loyal NATO member with zero hostility toward Washington, what protection does a non-NATO partner like Ukraine truly have? According to Danish national broadcaster DR, Trump's strategy to acquire Greenland involves 3 calculated phases. The first was the charm offensive. Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., visited Greenland in early January 2026, promoting investment and American engagement. The second phase is pressure on the Danish government, tariffs, military threats, and public humiliation. The third is Greenlandic societal infiltration, attempting to win over Greenland's population of 56,000 by offering economic incentives and exploiting any tensions between Nuuk and Copenhagen. This playbook should sound familiar to anyone who has studied Russian hybrid warfare. Moscow used similar tactics in Crimea: cultivate local discontent, apply external pressure, then present annexation as the natural solution. The difference is that Russia was acting against a geopolitical adversary. Trump is deploying these tactics against a NATO ally. On Truth Social, Trump posted, "NATO, tell Denmark to get them out of here now," while repeating false claims that Danish forces in Greenland consist of 2 dog sleds. This mockery of a NATO ally's military capabilities is not just insulting, it's strategically corrosive. It signals to adversaries like Russia and China that NATO solidarity is a fiction, that alliance commitments can be discarded when convenient. Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen minced no words. Trump speaks like a gangster in his threats against Greenland. On January 6, 2026, 6 major European powers, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland, issued a joint statement with Denmark declaring that Greenland is the rightful territory of its inhabitants, and only Denmark and Greenland can determine their affairs. The Nordic foreign ministers echoed this message. Even Croatia, a relatively small NATO member, released a statement calling on alliance members to respect each other's sovereignty. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated, "We will continue collaborating as allies on these critical matters." But the carefully diplomatic language cannot hide the fundamental problem. NATO has no mechanism to address when one member threatens another. Article 5, the Alliance's Collective Defense Clause, was designed to protect members from external aggression, not from internal coercion. The European Union has scheduled an emergency meeting for Thursday to deliberate responses, including retaliatory tariffs and activating the bloc's anti-coercion mechanism. But these are reactive measures that highlight Europe's limited leverage. The United States provides the nuclear umbrella, the intelligence backbone, and the logistical airlift capacity that make NATO functional. Europe can protest, but it cannot replace American military capabilities overnight. This is the strategic trap that Ukraine now finds itself observing. European solidarity statements are morally correct, but operationally insufficient. When push comes to shove, Europe struggles to translate diplomatic unity into hard power projection. Let's connect the dots with brutal honesty. Ukraine's ability to resist Russian aggression depends entirely on Western, and particularly American, military aid. The HIMARS systems that destroyed Russian command posts, the Javelin missiles that halted armored advances, the Patriot batteries defending Kyiv from missile strikes, all American. The F-16S that Ukraine desperately needs to contest Russian air superiority, American-made even when delivered through European partners. If Trump is willing to economically punish and militarily threaten Denmark over Greenland, what guarantee does Ukraine have that American support will continue? None. Consider the nightmare scenario. Trump reaches some accommodation with Putin over Ukraine, trading Ukrainian territory for Russian concessions elsewhere, while simultaneously demanding that European NATO members increase defense spending or face American withdrawal from the alliance. Europe, already economically strained and militarily dependent on Washington, would have limited options to resist. Denmark's intelligence services have already identified this threat. In December 2025, Danish intelligence labeled the United States as a potential security concern for the first time in an annual report, noting that Russia will attempt to exploit the U.S.'s eagerness for a swift conclusion to the Ukraine conflict to create discord between the U.S. and Europe. This is not anti-American paranoia. This is sober threat assessment from one of America's closest allies. Ukraine has already experienced betrayed promises. In 1994, Ukraine surrendered its nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world, in exchange for security assurances from the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia under the Budapest Memorandum. When Russia invaded in 2014 and again in 2022, those assurances proved worthless. Western aid has been crucial, but it has also been hesitant, incremental, and laden with restrictions that prevent Ukraine from striking military targets inside Russia. The Greenland crisis reinforces a bitter lesson. International agreements and alliance structures provide security only when the guarantor chooses to honor them. When strategic priorities shift, previous commitments become negotiable. There is a geographic parallel that Ukraine must recognize. Just as Greenland's Arctic position makes it strategically invaluable for monitoring Russian submarine activity and missile launches, Ukraine's Black Sea coastline is critical for containing Russian naval power and securing European energy routes. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, despite suffering devastating losses from Ukrainian naval drones and Neptune missiles, still poses a strategic threat. Ukrainian operations have demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Fiber-optic tethered drones evading jamming, AI-powered underwater drones sinking Russian submarines, long-range strikes on Novorossiysk port infrastructure. These successes have degraded Russia's ability to project power from Crimea and forced Moscow to relocate assets. But Ukraine achieved these victories with Western technology and intelligence support. The Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles that destroyed ammunition depots, the HIMARS systems that struck logistics hubs, the satellite intelligence that enabled precision targeting, all depended on continued Western commitment. If NATO fractures over Greenland, that commitment becomes uncertain. If European unity collapses under American pressure, Ukraine loses its most reliable supporters. Denmark's pledge of €1, 26 billion for Ukrainian drone production becomes meaningless if Copenhagen is simultaneously fighting to preserve its own territorial integrity. There's another dimension to this crisis that has profound implications for how territorial conflicts are understood globally. Greenland's population has made clear it has no interest in becoming part of the United States. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen has thanked European allies for their support and emphasized that only Greenlanders and Danes can decide the territory's future. If Trump somehow managed to impose American control over Greenland against local will, whether through economic coercion, political pressure, or unthinkably military force, what would follow? Would Greenlanders accept foreign rule peacefully? Or would an independence movement emerge, potentially turning violent? This is not hypothetical. History is littered with examples of occupations that appeared militarily straightforward but devolved into insurgencies. Afghanistan for both the Soviets and Americans, Iraq after 2003, Chechnya for Russia. The occupying power wins the conventional battle but loses the peace. Now imagine the geopolitical consequences of an American-backed insurgency in Greenland. Russia and China would gleefully arm and support Greenlandic resistance fighters, not because they care about Greenlandic independence, but because bleeding American resources in the Arctic serves their strategic interests. International law would be on the insurgents' side. The UN Charter explicitly protects territorial integrity and self-determination. Ukraine would watch this and draw the obvious parallel. If the United States cannot pacify a territory of 56,000 people without triggering international condemnation and guerrilla resistance, how can Russia hope to permanently occupy Ukrainian territories with populations in the millions who have spent years fighting invaders? This is why Ukraine must hope that the Greenland crisis resolves peacefully, not just because NATO unity benefits Kyiv strategically, but because any precedent of great powers successfully seizing territory from smaller neighbors, even allied neighbors, legitimizes Moscow's actions in Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. As this video is being prepared, An urgent diplomatic intervention is awaiting President Trump at the World Economic Forum in Davos. European leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, are preparing to confront Trump over his Greenland threats and tariff announcements. The stakes could not be higher. If European leaders can persuade Trump to back down, NATO might emerge bruised but intact. If they fail, the alliance faces an existential crisis that Putin could exploit ruthlessly. For Ukraine, the Davos meetings are a critical test. If European leaders can stand firm against American pressure over Greenland, it suggests they might also resist if Trump attempts to force a disadvantageous peace deal on Kyiv. If they cave, Ukraine should prepare for the worst. Early indications are not encouraging. Trump posted on Tuesday morning that there can be no going back regarding his Greenland ambitions. This is not the language of someone open to compromise. This is the rhetoric of a leader who has decided on a course of action and will not be deterred by diplomatic niceties. French officials have confirmed that messages between Trump and European leaders are authentic, and the tensions threaten to dominate the entire Davos summit. What should have been discussions about global economic policy, climate change, and artificial intelligence governance will instead be consumed by an intra-alliance crisis. This is exactly what adversaries want. While NATO members argue over Greenland, Russia consolidates control over occupied Ukrainian territory. While European and American diplomats exchange heated messages, Chinese naval forces expand their presence in the Pacific. While alliance solidarity fractures, Iran accelerates its nuclear program. Here is the scenario that keeps Ukrainian officials awake at night. Trump announces a grand bargain with Putin. Russia keeps Crimea and the land corridor to it, but withdraws from other occupied territories. In exchange, the United States lifts sanctions and normalizes relations with Moscow. European allies are presented with a fait accompli: accept the deal or face American withdrawal from NATO and punishing tariffs. Under that scenario, Ukraine's territorial integrity is sacrificed for broader geopolitical accommodation. And if Trump is willing to threaten Denmark with tariffs and military force over Greenland, why would he hesitate to pressure Ukraine into accepting permanent territorial losses? The Greenland crisis demonstrates that Trump views territorial sovereignty as negotiable, alliance commitments as conditional, and economic coercion as acceptable statecraft. These principles, applied to Ukraine, would be catastrophic. Ukrainian forces have fought with extraordinary courage and ingenuity. The same military that NATO assessments once predicted would collapse within days has now held off the world's supposedly second strongest military for nearly 3 years. Ukrainian drone operators have pioneered tactics that are reshaping modern warfare. Ukrainian engineers have developed systems that evade Russian electronic warfare and strike targets hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines. But courage and ingenuity cannot defeat cruise missiles without air defense systems. Drones cannot liberate occupied cities without artillery support. Tactical brilliance cannot overcome strategic supply shortages. Ukraine needs sustained Western support not just for months, but for years. The Greenland crisis raises the terrifying possibility that this support could evaporate not because Ukraine failed militarily, but because its most powerful backer decided that alliance solidarity and territorial integrity were less important than personal ambitions and deal-making with adversaries. First, Ukraine must strengthen its relationship with European NATO members, particularly those who have demonstrated consistent support: the United Kingdom, Poland, the Baltic states, and yes, Denmark. These countries understand that their own security depends on preventing Russian expansionism. They have concrete reasons to ensure Ukraine succeeds. Second, Ukraine must accelerate its domestic defense industry development. The €1.26 billion Danish investment in Ukrainian drone production is a model. Ukraine cannot rely solely on Western weapon systems that might be subject to political restrictions or supply interruptions. Indigenous production of drones, missiles, and electronic warfare systems provides strategic autonomy. Third, Ukraine must continue demonstrating military effectiveness. Every successful strike on Russian logistics, every destroyed command post, every sunken warship reinforces the argument that supporting Ukraine is a worthwhile investment. Western audiences and policymakers need to see that their aid is not being wasted, that Ukrainian forces are innovative, determined, and capable of inflicting costs on Russia that exceed the value of aid provided. Fourth, Ukraine must carefully navigate its public messaging about the Greenland crisis. Openly criticizing Trump risks alienating the American president and his supporters, potentially jeopardizing aid. But remaining silent while a NATO ally is threatened sends the wrong signal. The careful balance is to express support for Danish sovereignty and NATO unity without making it about Trump personally. Frame it as defending international law and alliance principles that also protect Ukraine. Fifth, Ukraine must prepare for scenarios where American support diminishes or ends. This means stockpiling ammunition, expanding European defense partnerships, and developing contingency plans for sustained operations with reduced Western assistance. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. The Greenland crisis exposes a fundamental truth that Ukraine has always known, but that Western nations sometimes forget. Security guarantees and alliance commitments are meaningless without the political will to enforce them. NATO's Article 5 Collective Defense Clause is often described as ironclad. An attack on one is an attack on all. But what happens when one member attacks another? The alliance has no mechanism for that scenario because it was literally unthinkable when NATO was founded. Similarly, Ukraine surrendered its nuclear weapons based on security assurances that proved empty. Western nations condemned Russian aggression and provided aid, but they did not enforce Ukraine's territorial integrity with direct military intervention. The support has been substantial, and Ukrainians are grateful for it, but it has also been limited by Western fears of escalation and concerns about provoking Russia. The lesson is harsh, but necessary. In international relations, there is no substitute for hard power. Ukraine cannot rely on Western guarantees alone. It must build the military capability to defend itself, even if Western support wanes. It must cultivate multiple international partnerships so that no single relationship becomes a point of failure. And it must develop economic and technological resilience so that sanctions and embargoes, whether imposed by adversaries or unreliable allies, cannot cripple national survival. The next few weeks will determine whether NATO survives as a credible security alliance or fractures into competing regional blocs. The Davos meetings, the EU emergency session, and the ongoing deployment of Danish troops to Greenland are all inflection points. For Ukraine, the stakes are existential. A NATO torn apart by internal conflict cannot provide credible security guarantees to anyone. A Western alliance divided over Greenland cannot maintain unified sanctions on Russia. An America willing to coerce allies economically and threaten them militarily is not a reliable partner for long-term security cooperation. Yet there is also reason for hope. European responses to the Greenland crisis have been remarkably unified. Even countries like Croatia, which has sometimes been more cautious about confronting great powers, have issued statements defending Danish sovereignty. The Nordic nations have stood together. France, Germany, and Britain have jointly condemned American threats. This unity, if maintained, could be the foundation for a more resilient European security architecture, one less dependent on American whims and more capable of independent action. Denmark has already pivoted toward deeper EU integration in response to security threats, abandoning its traditional skepticism about common defense and fiscal policies. Prime Minister Frederiksen has explicitly stated that Denmark's security depends on a strong, unified EU, not just on transatlantic ties. If the Greenland crisis accelerates European defense integration and reduces dependence on unpredictable American leadership, it might paradoxically strengthen Ukraine's long-term security prospects. A Europe capable of defending itself is a Europe that can credibly guarantee Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity regardless of American policy shifts. The crisis over Greenland is not a distraction from Ukraine's struggle. It is a warning about the fragility of the international order that Ukraine depends upon for survival. When a NATO member threatens another member's territory, when economic coercion replaces diplomatic dialogue, when alliance commitments become negotiable based on personal ambitions, the entire structure of collective security is at risk. Ukraine has learned through bitter experience that promises are cheap and power is expensive. The Greenland crisis reinforces that lesson for every small nation that has relied on great power guarantees for protection. But it also reveals opportunity. European unity in the face of American threats demonstrates that solidarity is possible when core principles are at stake. Denmark's determination to defend its sovereignty shows that even small nations can resist coercion when backed by allies. And the international condemnation of Trump's tactics proves that there are still limits to acceptable behavior, even for the world's most powerful nation. Ukraine must watch the Greenland crisis closely, learn its lessons, and adapt accordingly. The path to Ukrainian victory does not run through Washington alone. It runs through London, Warsaw, Tallinn, Copenhagen, and every other capital where leaders understand that allowing territorial aggression, whether by Russia against Ukraine or by anyone against anyone, sets precedents that threaten everyone. The frozen waters around Greenland and the contested fields of Donbass are separated by thousands of kilometers. But they are connected by a single principle: sovereignty matters, borders matter, and the international order either protects small nations from great power coercion, or it protects no one. This is NATO's moment of truth. This is Europe's test of resolve. And this is Ukraine's wake-up call to never, ever assume that Western support is guaranteed, only earned, maintained, and constantly reinforced through demonstrated value and strategic necessity. The fight continues. The stakes have never been higher, and the world is watching to see whether the principles that Western nations claim to defend are real, or just another set of empty promises that will be abandoned when they become inconvenient. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never forget that in the end, nations survive not because of others' promises, but because of their own strength, determination, and unwillingness to surrender what is rightfully theirs.